I mentioned that obviously at the moment Keir Starmer's on his world trip or a trip around the different places to basically unpack Brexit, it seems like it. And he's been welcomed. He was on the front page of The Standard yesterday and various other papers. Entente cordiale, thumbs up for a post-Brexit reset is what they're suggesting. What's your take on that, John?
Well, I don't know what exactly they are discussing, but I strongly suspect that it's got to do with military cooperation and in particular Ukraine. This is one of the main axes by which post-Brexit Britain, including under the Conservatives, has tried to maintain its profile within the European Union, even though, of course, it's not a member of the European Union anymore. Britain is the largest military power, the largest intelligence power in Europe, probably larger even than France, or more or less the same, but possibly slightly larger. And Britain has sought ever since 2019, ever since 2016, in fact, when or 2017 rather, when the Brexit process was started, Britain has sought to emphasize its role in European security in order, as I say, to compensate for what the British elites, the British deep state, considers to be a loss of influence as a result of Brexit. And as we know, Britain has taken a very, very strong lead in Ukraine. It has tried to present itself as the strongest ally of Ukraine in Europe. And the country which is probably the second strongest ally, apart from Poland, of course, is probably France. And obviously France has a large military. I say France in second position because let's not forget that it was Macron, I think it was back in June, who suggested sending French troops into battle in Ukraine. That was a very radical suggestion. It hasn't been followed up on, but he suggested it. So Britain and France are singing from the same hymn sheet on this. And I suspect that is how Starmer is trying to bring about his reset. I imagine that it's around military cooperation. Franco-British military cooperation goes back a very long way. It goes back to the days of Jacques Chirac. In the 1990s, there have been a series of bilateral military accords. I'm sure there'll also be trade issues and so on, but I suspect that is the key issue facing the two leaders today.
Yeah, I think, also there's this whole discussion about small boats, which has dominated the election that we had here and the big campaign up to basically the election in July. What's the take? I'm always interested in how things are perceived and reported around the world in different ways. You're in France at the moment. How is the relationship perceived in the press between the UK and France at the moment?
Well, the issue of the small boats is not really very present, I would say, in the French media or in the French public consciousness. I think the relationship is perceived as not being very close. I think the French generally, and certainly the French political class, took Brexit as a personal insult. They thought, well, why don't you like us anymore? There was a rather childish reaction to Brexit, which persists. There's a deeply entrenched belief in the French political class that Brexit was a mistake and that Britain is now on the verge of collapse as a result. You hear that all the time. And of course, whenever there are riots or whenever there are economic difficulties, as obviously there are in Britain, then that is taken by the media political class as proof of the failure of Brexit. But on the issue of small boats, I'm sure Starmer will raise it and will say that he's raised it, but there is literally nothing that can be done about the small boats for a very simple reason, and that is that there is, as everybody knows, something called the Schengen Agreement within the European Union, which means that there are no internal borders between European states. If you go between France and Italy, there's no physical border at all, or between France and Germany, or France and Spain. And that means that as soon as you land in Lampedusa, which is a few miles from the Libyan coast, the Italian island of Lampedusa, then you are effectively in France. You are legally in France, and therefore you are legally in Calais, and you can therefore easily get into a dinghy and cross the channel. And until Schengen is abrogated, which I don't think it will be, this industrial level of population movement will continue. Schengen is it causes it. Schengen is the cause of this, because people know that they only have to get into the Canary Islands, or as I say, Lampedusa, in order to have the entire Schengen space at their disposal. Of course, the French say that they will try to prevent people from crossing the Channel, but I mean, they've got God knows how many people on their territory, as do all European states, who shouldn't be there. There are probably millions of illegal immigrants, and it would require sort of industrial levels of rounding up and police operation to get rid of all of them. Yes, there are always a few hundred in Calais ready to cross on the next dinghy, but there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions on the whole territory of France, and many more millions elsewhere in Europe. So. And Schengen, of course, is one of the causes of that, because, as I say, there's no control at the frontier anymore. So you simply can't prevent people coming, say, from Italy into France or from Spain into France.
Yeah. James?
Absolutely, I agree with John. I think the Schengen, area is part of the problem for Europe. I think personally, it should national borders should be reinstated. I mean, it's not that much of an inconvenience, really, is it? If the only real checks you're doing is just to see who you are as you pass from country to country, rather than, you don't need to check vehicles and do all of that. You just need to check people. But look, in terms of Starmer's kind of renegotiations of relationships with Europe, I think he should be very, very careful, because, I'm a former Brexit MEP, so I guess you could say, well, he would say that. But if you look at the figures, Labour got 9.7 million votes in the recent general election. The turnout was pretty poor. It was clear that it was the split vote, really, between Reform and the Conservatives, which handed them such a large majority. But if you compare that 9.7 million votes to over 17 million people who voted for Brexit, it's clear Starmer does not have a mandate to undo Brexit. So I think he should be very, very careful. Their honeymoon period is already over, I think, after the riots and his handling of that. So, yeah, I mean, again, I think all of these things are going to come back to bite Labour over the next 18 months.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I've put out beforehand that if there were an election again today in the UK, I think it might have a very different result. I think the honeymoon period for two-tier Keir, as he's now called, and all these other things that are coming back to bite people, they're stopping people smoking, even in pub gardens now. All these sort of plans are really quite scary, as well as the clampdown on free speech, which we're going to come on to. I want to, first of all, just before leaving Macron and there's discussions, if you like, you mentioned about Ukraine. Well, Macron's also supposed to be going to Serbia later this week, and he wants to, I think in the next few days, and he's hoping to sell 12 Rafale fighter jets, which are made by the French company. This is going to signify a significant shift for Serbia from its traditional reliance on Russian military equipment. What's your take on that, John?
Well, Serbia has been playing for some years now quite a clever game, given its objective weakness. It's a relatively small country, quite poor and so on, not in the EU, not in NATO. And its weakness is aggravated, of course, by the fact that part of its territory is occupied by NATO, Kosovo, and governed by the European Union and so on. It's also trying to balance the issue of neighboring Bosnia. Bosnia has been sort of teetering on the verge of collapse now for 25 years, and the Bosnian Serb president has once again raised the possibility of a referendum in the Serbian part of Bosnia, which might perhaps lead to some kind of union between those territories and Serbia itself. So it's a very vulnerable country, surrounded, as I say, by NATO powers. But it does, given that vulnerability, play its few cards relatively well. I've no idea whether the Serbs will buy the French jets, because they have tended to, as I say, balance between, with, of course, continuing to have relatively good relations with Russia. So maybe, yes, maybe Vučić, the Serbian president, will decide to go ahead with that purchase in order to, reburnish his credentials with the Europeans. It's quite possible.
James, any takes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly small deal, to be honest with you. I think it's the rumours are that it's around 3 billion euros. So pretty small fish, really. But I think the political implications, as John has already set out, are clear. And, you know, France, I would say, along with the UK in Europe, are the most pro sort of anti-Russian countries. You know, they're the ones pushing for, you know, a much more aggressive approach in Ukraine towards Russia. So I think this just is in line with that French sort of foreign policy on things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love Serbia. I've been invited by the royal family to go and compare again at the White Palace, which I'll be doing in October with their Royal Highnesses Alexander and Princess Catherine, and they do some fantastic work around the world. But they've gone through some terrible times, Serbia, and it's history, and it is interesting that, as you say, it's a relatively small deal, and why the press are picking up on Macron in particular. But I guess he's flying the French flag, even if it's the sale of these sort of bits and pieces, these weapons and instruments of war. Is that perceived as a good thing in France, generally, John?
Yes, but I think it is in Britain as well. Yeah, I mean, after all, we don't really make anything else anymore in Britain, and we are as much. We push our own arms sales as much as the French do. I mean, there was. It was 2 years ago now, but the famous AUKUS deal with Australia, which was at the expense of France for a very large number of submarines, and which was in favour of the Americans. So yeah, we do that all the time. I mean, it's part of the course.
Yeah, well, as James said, it's a relatively small deal. I think these 12 things are about €3 billion, but it all adds to it.